righty, we are ready to go.
Okay.
So who's chairing this meeting?
I don't mind.
Oh, okay. No, I was just asking.
So I just think we jump right into the
Okay.
proposed changes that Chip put on the code of conduct
Okay.
based on feedback from our previous meetings, and then also those that were given in council when this was brought up. And so, Velvet, is it you that's sharing your screen, or Chip? Do you want
Yeah.
to scroll down and we can get to that, and we'll just take it section by section, I guess, or overall, if there was something that off the bat jumped out to someone.
Right.
Okay. So Chip, you want to start going down? So the first thing, and if
Okay.
you want to walk through the amendments made, I mean, the first thing was we just included the oath of office. So it was here as a reference point.
Yeah, and that's Councilmember Seekings, I think, suggested that. So it's just a member shall act at all times in accordance with the member's oath of office. And that's the first part is from the state constitution. That's required for everybody to sign. And it's the same for the mayor and council members. And then the second part is from state statute. And it is also the same for mayor and council members.
So in other words, Chip, is the oath of office the same for everyone across the state?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I didn't realize that.
And then the second part, just definition of member, is the mayor and the individual members of council. We have a lot of different definitions for city council and members of council, and I just wanted to make sure that the mayor was included. The third portion, I think I added the red line after I forget if it was after the first meeting of this committee, but so there's a section 61 of Robert's rules that applies for breaches of order by members in a meeting where you call a point of order and the chairperson makes a ruling on it. And I just wanted to ensure, number one, that the other ethical rules and state and federal rules and Robert's rules all remain in place if this ordinance is adopted. I'm happy to answer your questions on that.
Okay.
If anybody has any. And then I took out, I think this was all the stuff that was previously in there, the compliance and enforcement about the whole mayor thing. And I've highlighted where there's sort of numbers requirements so that everybody's aware of it and, if you want to go with this version, it's easy to vote, 3/4 or 1/2 or what have you. But this is a lot of it, Robert's rules distinguishes between breaches of codes outside of the meeting and inside of the meeting. And Robert's rules handles very well what happens inside of the meeting. It sets up a procedure for handling breaches of code of conduct outside of the meeting, but it doesn't really set a substantive standard. So, if you're in a corporation, your bylaws would handle that.
Yeah.
We have some substantive provisions in our ordinance already, cursing, those types of things that I think are primarily in meetings. The one thing I think is required I don't mean to advocate that we, over or supervise members outside of meetings. That's kind of a policy decision, but to the extent you do, due process requires sort of it's almost like a trial style hearing. And it's not exactly like a trial, but you have to give notice of the violation. You have to have a public hearing. You have to notify the member of what the violation is. There's a lot of due process attributes to that because it's a governmental entity potentially disciplining a member. There's nothing wrong with condemning, and I don't mean to bring this up as the primary issue, but if you're talking about like white supremacy as an issue, well, I do mean to bring it up, but it's the first example that pops in my head. I don't mean to keep revisiting that portion of it, but there's nothing wrong with condemning white supremacy. I mean, if you want to condemn what a council member says or doesn't say about white supremacy, that's more problematic, especially outside of a meeting. It's more problematic. You have to have witnesses who have seen the conduct and can testify to it, or that meet the sort of traditional evidence rules. You can't have hearsay. In some cases, that doesn't matter if there's hard proof, like it's in writing or something like that. But Robert's rules sort of contemplates a hearing. The only state law procedure for disciplining a member by city council is forfeiture of office. And that requires you to be, if someone's convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude, a member, then they can be declared as having forfeit their office by city council. Okay. There's also, there's other provisions that I don't think it would take an extreme situation for them to apply. Like I think it says violation of chapters 1 through 17 of Title 5 of the code. And I mean, there's really nothing in there that would sort of pop out at you as this is just so egregious that, we should just, we need to throw this member out of office. Not saying it didn't happen, but yeah.
So when we're talking about something that is said or done outside of council chambers, that's where things get sticky, in other words. So I guess,
Yes.
What I'm thinking about is, you hear these examples of a school teacher who, posts a racy photo of herself on Instagram or, something like that. And she's fired from her job. How does that work? How does something like that get set up? Is that because when you become employed by that institution, you sign some kind of employee handbook
Yeah, that would be.
I guess I'm
handbook.
just trying to understand more because I don't know how.
That would be an employee handbook type issue. Members of council, according to our outside council that handles our employment matters, are not considered employees, so they're not governed by the employee handbook. But typically, it doesn't create a contract of employment, but you would sign notice that you received it. And if it meets all the other conditions, it's sort of the rules governing your employment. I think that there are additional limits for governmental entities with employees, but it's more or less the same as it would be for a private company.
So, I've used this example and I always all caps, a bunch of exclamation points. This is purely just an example. This is not anything that has happened to me. I'm just, creating a what if scenario. So let's say, you have a female council member who a male council member acted inappropriate, made an unwanted sexual advance to her. Now, typically in an employment situation, HR would step in, sexual harassment, you would look into that. Since we're not looked upon as employees in the traditional sense, then how does that happen? How does that play out?
I think you'd have to build in a procedure for council to act on that matter, assuming you wanted that procedure in place. And I, obviously I've never been in the situation, but
Mhm.
I can see the pluses and minuses for people wanting the procedure in place. It's, there's nothing that would preclude you, I mean, it's still a private issue. So there's no, I mean, you're still subject to criminal laws and other things.
Right.
And council members are subject to rules against harassing employees. Like you would have to uphold the a workplace free of harassment for those types of things. But there's no, and this is getting according to our outside counsel, there's no true mechanism, absent city council really adopting something by ordinance, of council members sort of governing those types of issues internally.
And I think that that's something that just jumps to my head because it's something we constantly hear about on the news. And I don't know if we've ever had an issue like that. I pray to God we have not, nor will we ever. But those are the types of issues that I think about, that I would like some kind of mechanism in place that somebody feels protected, especially if we're talking about issues here being more like council members interacting with other council members or doing something that affects other council members. And I don't know as though some of these issues we necessarily want to have thrown onto council floor. And, I don't want someone to feel as though they can't share a concern because it then has to be brought out publicly.
Yeah, I completely understand. I
Some issues
I
are
have a
really
6-year-old
sensitive.
daughter, so if nothing else, I can understand in that
Right.
context. I think the concern I would have of handling it internally is there's no good penalty mechanism
Mhm.
built in. I haven't seen any built into ordinances. I've seen, mostly, except for the state law on declaring somebody having forfeited their office and therefore the office is vacant, you have a special election. There's really no teeth other than sort of a censure, or you might lose committee status. But, as far as building in, I can ask our employment attorney, but I've never seen anything where there's like a fine or, certainly jail time. You'd have to file a police report anyway. So I think most municipalities would handle it that way.
Mhm.
I'm not saying you couldn't do that, but I think the
You would
problem is
you would
it's not
handle
really
it more
set
as
up.
you would handle it more as like as a citizen and private civil suit type of thing as opposed to
Yeah, and a criminal complaint, because obviously if,
Mhm.
harassment could also be a crime involving moral turpitude
Right.
and subject the person to forfeiture from office. And I would probably in that situation, if the person were convicted, so the governor, I think if you're accused of a crime involving or it might be a grand jury indicts you, can suspend you from your office. Council has the ability to kick you out of office, but only if you're convicted of the crime.
Okay.
It's sort of a weird thing with the state laws, but that's all state law and it's built into our ordinance. But that's the only penalty I'm aware of that state law, expressly imposes. Otherwise, everybody seems to defer to Robert's rules, which is really, it's geared towards censure or some sort of loss of committee status, or a chairperson. If you're a chairperson of a committee, or if you might lose being on the committee. But again, even in those situations, Robert's rules and what I've read suggests due process would require, if it's something that council members don't see with their own eyes in council, that there needs to be an actual hearing on it to censure the member or to impose other types of sanctions. It's just not, city council is not really geared toward enforcing laws itself, except in those circumstances. They can make laws that other people enforce, but it's not really there's not many situations where city council actually enforces laws against one another or
Right.
enforces laws against private people themselves. You usually don't write the laws and then write the tickets as well.
Right. Okay.
And whether that may be a separation of powers issue, I don't know, but that's what jumps into my head is maybe a reason for that.
So I'm not, like, from my perspective, that's like that's just something that speaks to me, and I'm sure it's because of my gender, right? So I look at things from that perspective. Um, so that's why I've just been expressing a concern over some sort of protection mechanisms in place if there is some kind of example like that. Um, as far as from here, I mean, to me, like when I read this number one right here, it's almost like the same as, one person makes a motion, it gets seconded, and then it has to, you have to, rather than a simple majority, this one says 3/4. So whether we want to make it a simple majority or a super majority or something like that, I don't have a strong feeling one way or another regarding that. But certainly if somebody else does, that's certainly, I'm open to that.
Yeah.
I guess, some these just kind of raise these questions of if somebody does something outside of their oath of office or outside of council, pulling that in, you know, I think, that's where things just get really tricky. I mean, I am trying to figure out if there's any way that we can is there a way to make it clean? I think that's what the goal of this is. If there's a clear cut path forward while respecting all parties involved. So, but Keith.
Thank you, Judge Chapo. On this item one, I would be against the 3/4. And obviously I want to be consistent. You all may remember when we had the 3/4 rule to override the planning commission. And that dated back from the late 1930s. I think what our legal told us that. And it was a 75% override and it included the total elected body, not 3/4 of a quorum. So I'm okay with simple majority or 2/3, whatever the pleasure of the group is. Just trying to maybe move this along. The goal, Mr. McQueenie, the goal of the code of conduct, I don't want to sound trite, but if we do something illegal, the governor's going to take care of that and move us out of office. So the goal of the code of conduct, the primary goal is what?
I think that's kind of up to you all. I mean, I wrote it so that it's sort of difficult to get to the point of a public hearing and to convict on a public hearing.
Right.
I think based on, I think that was the committee's idea as well, but originally, just because naturally I'm a very rules oriented person. Like I generally follow rules. I'm a military brat. So
Right.
I do that, but I'm very lenient on punishing people. I'll yell at people, but I don't like, I would make a terrible judge because I would let everybody off. I just have too much sympathy for people in that situation.
Well, number one, I thank you for writing it that way. That's difficult to get to a public hearing because
right.
One of
Yeah,
my major
absolutely.
concerns is, frankly, political smears, using the oath of office, not necessarily to find somebody guilty. The accusation, see, in the day's press is worse than the final result sometimes. So, so I appreciate you writing it that way. But I think the 3/4 threshold, when I look at, is there anything else in city council? I don't think we do that requires I know maybe to add something to the agenda, I think it takes 2/3 to add something, that's not properly advertised to the agenda. But I don't think it takes I don't think we have that 3/4 anywhere in the ordinance and approve anything. I certainly hesitate. I don't hesitate. I'm against going back to doing 3/4 for anything.
Mhm. I think that's a good point. If you keep it consistent with how we handle other, handling anything else.
I agree, and I'll use myself. If I did something wrong, and a majority of my colleagues, or certainly 2/3 of my colleagues, think, "Hey, wait a minute, we need to hold you accountable, and you need to explain yourself," whatever. Um, I'm a part of an elected body, and I have to work with people. And if I got a majority or 2/3 saying you did something wrong, then yeah, I think I need to be brought forward. Okay, so I use myself as an example on that. But um, I am cautious of people being smeared because I can see how. So I can see how a code of conduct um, in a political environment can be used to, frankly, embarrass, in particular during election years. So I don't want to create something that does that. Mr. McQueenie, when it comes to something that has happened often from in political office from one end of the state to the other, when people move out of the district, do we have something already in the code that takes care of that?
I think
Yeah, I don't see Chip.
I think he just dropped off because like the
Oh,
screen
okay.
share went away and I don't see him. But I mean, while we wait for him to come back on, Keith, I think that's my concern too. I don't want to do something where it just becomes political fodder.
Right, right.
And so, I mean, like the example that I used of, someone, making an advance on someone else or, things like that. And, I don't like the idea of, a public hearing and things like that. I mean, unless it's just something absolutely, I kind of look at this like impeachment, right? Like
Yeah,
this isn't just something you just use.
right. Yeah,
um, and so I think
I
that's
agree.
what I would like to know is that those protection mechanisms are in place because it's not just, oh, well, you posted something on Facebook that I don't like or whatever
Right,
it is.
right, right.
Um,
So
where
hypothetically,
I'm running against you. And so I'm going to look for any means possible to make your life miserable.
right, right. I think if we look at it logically, I agree with you 100%. So hypothetically, if we don't do 75%, if we want to make it difficult, then would it be a 2/3 vote, which is a little higher threshold than a simple majority? So I think either way would be fine. A little higher threshold would be 2/3. But I got to tell you, if you got 2/3 of the vote saying that you need to be censured or I need to be censured, then that's true. It needs to go forward.
Right. What I think my hope too is that like you wouldn't, I don't know, this is kind of how I always look at everything, but I wouldn't want this done to me over, any little blunder. So I wouldn't use it for against someone else for, something that
Right,
was
right,
maybe
right.
said in the heat of the moment or, something like that. And, and then if somebody has apologized and things like that, and we can all move
Right,
on.
right.
Um,
You see,
and
that's the
I
thing.
should hope that that's how the 12 of us are, and I think that that's how most people
You see,
are.
that's the thing about this. I mean, when we look, you look back through council's history. There've been a lot of things that have come up that have been uh, that people could have been embarrassed by, or maybe the embarrassment extended. I think I lost. Okay, okay, okay. That and you know what? The public kind of happened, kind of stepped in on things like that. So I mean, um, we've had people move out. Matter of fact, not only move out the district and move out the city, we had people moved out the county.
I don't and I would think that that's not necessarily a code of conduct issue. I would think that's like if you don't reside where
Yeah, I'm thinking we got
over the
something else in the
people,
code
you know,
that
in the
takes care
same
of
place
that.
as the people you represent, that's crazy to me.
Right.
I'm so sorry. My internet crashed and
That's
That's
apparently my
okay.
phone
I'm gonna
back-
tell you, you were sorely missed, man, because I'm telling you, I asked a question about if a person were to move out the district, for example. Isn't there another part of our code that takes care of that?
Yeah, so if you lose your qualifications, that's the third one. It's if you violate chapters 1 through 17, if you commit or you're convicted of a crime against moral turpitude, and if you lose your qualifications from office, because I did all that research on, the Councilmember Regal.
Right.
And, it was, you still had to have a public hearing. Under state law, you have to have a public hearing to declare any of those. And I think he was close enough that to re-election that I think there was something where he would have served, had we had the hearing and he had been convicted, he would have served for like, or somebody else would have served for like a month, and then his successor in the general election would have taken over. So that was a weird situation. And the other thing when you forfeit office is you have to have a special election if it's, I think, more than 180 days of the general before the general election, which is not that it should matter, but it's very expensive to do that. So, I mean, I think most people agree it should be a very high bar to trigger that.
If we follow along your track of making it difficult, not easy, but difficult to, I guess, use my vernacular to smear a person. I think you were still on when I said being against the 3/4. Hypothetically, if 2/3 were there, so 3/4 was replaced by 2/3. And I guess then we continue down.
Can I ask a question, Chip? It's Rick and members, council members. As we're going through redistricting, and it gets to the question you just asked, Councilman Waring, about not living in the district that you represent. Going through redistricting, we may have that situation, depending on what the new district lines are. So as we go through this, we've got to keep redistricting in mind. So you may get a situation where somebody is elected, but the district lines are drawn and he or she may no longer be in that district until we hold the special election. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think in this one, I'm talking about somebody that moves out and doesn't tell, like Eagle did.
Yeah, I hear you, but I'm just saying as we do that, we got to keep redistricting in mind somehow as well, so that there's an exception.
Right. It's almost like a carve out,
Yes.
Obviously somebody can't help how district lines are redrawn. That's,
Exactly.
That's not something that they've brought on themselves.
Yeah, you're right. For example, right now, I don't know what we're going to do, but I've seen the articles in the paper and the op-ed pieces, but when districts are redrawn, obviously we have a staggered system. So I represent an odd number district. So when that district is redrawn, they're going to be people, I may still be in the district, but they're going to be new people to the district that would have not voted for me while in my latter 2 years in office. So yeah, I see how that can happen. You're right, Rick. You're right on that one. So
yeah, and we're gonna have a workshop on redistricting this month to really go over the law and some options and stuff. But just think we need to keep that exception in mind.
If Mr. McQueenie would do that for us, we'd be fine.
Excuse me? Sorry.
I said if you would kind of keep that in mind.
Oh, the residence exception?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's interesting reading because you can be a de facto member if city council doesn't remove you, which means none of your votes are called into question. I kind of put it like this: it's better to be represented by somebody who's formerly in the district than nobody on council.
Yeah.
So my research suggests that as long as city council doesn't take action to remove somebody from office in those circumstances, they're still a de facto member of city council, and until their successor is elected and that person takes their place.
Okay.
Chip, going back, oh, sorry, Councilman Ware.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted to, you were saying a little while ago something about outside of council chambers. Are you saying this would not cover things that happen outside of our chambers, our meetings, those types of things?
No, this would primarily cover that. I mean,
Gotcha.
I don't think you need to, you might want to get rid of Robert's rules, but Robert's rules would currently, the procedure is covered by Robert's rules for things that happen outside council. You know, if somebody does something wrong, there's no standard necessarily in Robert's rules of when you use that procedure, which I think is what this would do. This also changes the procedure in Robert's rules, and that all these votes aren't necessarily straight majority. It makes it a lot more difficult to get to an actual public hearing on somebody violating an oath of office than Robert's rules would make it.
Okay. All right. For example, I thought about this. Councilman Ross Appel did an outstanding job of speaking to a group that I'm a member of about a month ago. He did an outstanding job. There was no questions, but at the end there was time for questions, and he did an outstanding job with that. There's no problems there. But I was thinking when this was going on, now we've got a couple people. In fact, I was a little worried because we've got some guys in our club that like to stir the pot a little bit, and they pay attention to what's going on. And I was a little bit concerned for Ross, to be honest with you, that somebody would ask something that would be complicated. But then I got to thinking about this, and I said, well, wait a minute. If Ross ought to have the right to say exactly what's in his heart and in his mind, but if I disagree with it, by this, I can grab 2 additional members and say, hey, I'm going to put this thing up, and we're going to cause a fuss over what Ross said to this particular group. And that's what concerns me about this right here, because, you know, Councilman Waring talked about smearing and things like that. But if I completely disagreed, I could say, man, he's trying to stir up trouble, and we're going to do this, and it's going to cause a problem because it's going to be in the paper, it's going to be all over the news, you know, those types of things. When in all actuality, he may not have done anything wrong, and it may get voted down. But this is going to open the door to all kinds of issues because maybe politically he thought something different than I did. And that's what concerns me about this whole situation with the code of conduct.
I get that.
Yeah, I do as well.
Because Kevin's right. Well, yes, you have to have, 2/3 vote in order to bring it forth for discussion. Once it's brought up, it's out there. And, using this example, again, purely hypothetical, Ross is now getting the phone calls and the emails and having to explain himself. So I get that. And honestly, that's not something that I had considered from that angle. So, which is interesting.
I think Mayor Tecklenburg's trying to speak.
I didn't know who was conducting the meeting.
Yes, please.
Madam Chair, did y'all dial back number 1 to be 2/3 rather than for 3/4?
I'm using 2/3. That's what Keith had suggested.
Yeah. So, and I apologize.
So I like that.
I got to run on to something else, and I would say generally I'm supportive with whatever y'all want to do, but I would agree with that just to have a hearing, 2/3 sounds like enough to me. But I would keep the other one at 3/4 because you want to keep the bar pretty high on this thing. And by having the bar pretty high, you avoid hopefully the possibility of what Councilmember Shealy just, you'd have to have a lot of collusion to just use this in a political fashion. So I know that's not the intent. Hopefully that would not happen.
So 2/3 to bring it forward, 3/4 to convict.
Right.
Right.
That seems reasonable. to
And
me.
I think that's a logical approach to make it much harder to convict somebody than to bring something forward for
Even
discussion.
a majority to have the hearing, I think, is too low,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
I agree with that too, Mr. Mayor. The majority
Mhm.
is two. I think 2/3 does it. But
Yeah.
but Mr. Mayor, I hate to even go back to 3/4 on anything with the city. And it's not because of this, it's because of that, that override of the planning commission. So
We,
I
we,
want
we
to
have,
start a precedence in the other direction.
we have a lot of memories about that. I understand. All right, well, I apologize. I gotta
All
run
right,
off.
see you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you.
I'm happy with whatever y'all approve. Thank you.
So, I mean, and I don't want to name any kind of specifics or anything like that, but it's amazing to me what things folks will grab onto, and take it and run wild with it and make a huge thing over. And then other things that happen that are probably worse, and it just kind of goes over people's head. And and I guess that's just human nature, right? And it's whatever, is so I think that's the whole thing, that is just inherently unfair is you could say something and it's completely inappropriate. You could do something that's completely inappropriate, but maybe it's not the new, what makes good headlines.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gets swept under the rug, but you do something else and it just is like wildfire because it's what they love to talk about on the Today Show, and it's the big hot topic of the day. And so I mean that's where all this just gets to be such a rub. And I think more than anything, I want people to have a space in which, if they are being, their feet being held to the fire, they have some sort of space and a container in which to share their perspective, which may even just be, you know what, I said something wrong and or I did something wrong, and there's, I'm committed to doing X, Y, and Z, or, whatever it is that's just a space for them to present what they need to present.
I agree what you're saying.
And I don't know if this does that. That's my vision.
Well, I've had a chance to speak, so I see Ross got his finger up, so let me yield.
Well, thank you, Councilman Waring. And, I think everybody's made excellent points this afternoon. But I'll sort of give another perspective on this. I actually think that having a framework in place like this will actually disincentivize political cheap shots that, can get thrown around. And here's why. Today, any of us could get on the phone and pick up the phone and talk to Andrew Brown, or last year, Michaela, and we can say anything about anybody and get it into the paper. Yeah. We don't need any kind of framework to do this. What this does is it provides a forum for people to actually channel those things. In other words, like, if you're just going to pop off, that's, if you really have something, come forward with it in this procedural framework, right? If you're just going to kind of talk, well, then that's sort of indicative of the fact that maybe you don't have a whole lot of support, both on council and from an evidentiary standpoint. So, unfortunately, I think we already live in an environment where it's easy to, be political and take shots at other council members and things of that nature. And that's just a reality of, the thought would be that this is a structure that helps channel that and hopefully disincentivizes the more knee-jerk kind of poorly thought out attacks, for lack of a better word, because if you bring something up to the floor through this process and you can't get that 2/3 to even have a hearing, well, you're going to look like a fool, right? And that is going to serve, I think, as a disincentive for people to really move forward with this kind of framework. And that's frankly why I think we have these sort of enhanced thresholds to get the process moving, because we don't want it to be a lever that's so easily pulled. Because normally all it takes is a motion and a second to get something on the table for discussion. I mean, here we're going to need a motion, 2 additional members to second, and then a 2/3 vote. I agree with Councilman Waring and the mayor and others that there should be a different threshold to have the hearing versus to convict. And I think that sort of tracks the way things are done in the federal Constitution. So that's just another thought of that. But I mean, sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we don't want to get ourselves into a situation where we're spending all of our time, demanding hearings for each other. And I hope that, just like a lot of things that we're entrusted with, we don't use these powers in an irresponsible way. I mean, we could have voted last night to raise our taxes to the max allowed under South Carolina law. There's nothing that stopped us from doing that other than good judgment and political realities. And I think that there'll similarly be checks on the incentive structure to move forward with this process. The last thing I'll say is, somebody asked earlier, what is the purpose of this whole framework? And I think that what it is it's a mechanism for the city council to regulate itself as a body. And when things happen that impugn the integrity of the city itself, and I think it's helpful for there to be a mechanism in place for the city to speak with one voice in terms of its position on what's happened. And my hope is that this would be something that is used in extraordinarily rare circumstances. And I just think that without that, when we have issues that take place and there's no mechanism for that, we have a lot of people in the public that perhaps rightfully ask, what is the city's position on this behavior? Because the reality of it is that, crimes are one thing, but sometimes you can do things that are really terrible, that aren't crimes, but nonetheless reflect poorly on the city, erode confidence in our government, and make it all harder for us to do our job. So those are just some thoughts. But at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not like I said from day one on this whole thing, I'm not like worked up, about this one way or the other. I think that this ordinance has really come a long way. It's very simple. It's very elegant. I think Chip's done a very good job with it. And I'm happy with whatever the group's consensus is ultimately.
Listen, what you said, Ross, I agree with. As a matter of fact, I never thought about it from the standpoint of, let's say, a grandstander bringing it to the floor, not getting the votes, and being embarrassed. That's actually a pretty good point. I didn't think about it.
I hadn't thought about that either. It is a really good point.
So,
I'm an expert in public embarrassment, guys. I know how you can approach it from every angle.
Mr. McQueenie, on something like this to be brought, could it trigger going into executive session? Let's just say, I'm a grandstander. I'm not trying to. I know I may not be able to get the votes, but I got 15 minutes on the floor to, rant and rave and embarrass. But could it be something when that comes up, kind of like a point of order, or when somebody says, puts a motion on the floor to defer, you know how it pauses the discussion and carries you to another part of Robert Rules of Order. So, or again, if somebody puts a substitute motion on the floor, it suspends the discussion on the previous question. When somebody comes up with, you know, an accusation or whatever, could that automatically, can this be written to where it would trigger an executive session? And then you go into the executive session. If you want to come back out with an action step to take a vote for, you know, to have a, but all the minutia going back and forth, maybe during that period of time, maybe can be taken. I'm thinking about you, Ms. Chapa, we're taking that out of the embarrassment realm, and you know, and the rest of us having to listening to it, knowing it's not right, but you know, you get 15 minutes to talk. So can something like that be added to it?
Yes, sir. I mean, I think the obvious way to me to do it would be to put that you can always request executive session for legal advice. So, you know, if you had a question about whether or not a particular situation may have violated the oath, you could certainly ask for an executive session so that corporation counsel could give you legal advice on whether or not there's been a violation of the, or you know, what the oath covers or something like that. In which case you could do it that way, and you could do that anyway, regardless of the ordinance. But I don't think it hurts to put something, if you prefer, to put something in there saying, you know, any member may ask to go in executive session to receive legal advice as to whether or not.
So, for example, let's say I have the floor, and I'm just laying the wood to Kevin, man. I'm just weighing him out on something, okay? And that he did that I thought was, you know, violation of moral turpitude or whatever. Is there a mechanism where another member can head that off by saying executive session or whatever, you know? Right now I'm thinking about, you know, motions that suspend conversations, you know. Is there a methodology that could be used that would trigger, well, we can do this, you know, the ordinance calls for an executive session. In other words, to shut me up so I don't get my 15 minutes of fame.
Which I think is a smart idea. I mean, obviously, you know, if there's sensitive, confidential information, I think, again, it's another layer to this. And also, I wouldn't want somebody to wind up, you know, in some kind of slanderous situation or something like that. So I think there is an appropriateness to move into executive session and with the attorneys for it to be done legally and to obtain that legal advice. So you don't wind up with a compounding of problems.
Put some thought into it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's smart.
And you can always, you know, even without the ordinance as a whole, you can always call a point of order and ask for legal advice about the point of order, you know, whether it's an order or something like that. You know, that's always a way to sort of slow those types of attacks down without necessarily, you know, getting into whether or not it is an attack. Well, you get into it, but you don't necessarily have to take action on it. You can go into executive session and discuss it.
Okay.
Receive legal advice, not discuss it, but receive legal advice.
I just think about some of the, you know, colorful personalities we've had on council over the decades, you know, you know, because I like this guy, but he's real colorful, you know, Larry Shirley, you know, but he never was embarrassing like that. There are times when some people, I don't know, Quadro Campbell or even, you know, Robert Ford in his day, you know. I mean, there may be others, but anyway, I'm just thinking of a way to cut that. To cut it, that's all. Mm-hmm. Just put some thoughts to it, that's all, Mr. McQueen, if you could. So we can continue down and work our way through this. Where are we now? The next point that we need to vet out.
But yeah, I think we're at 2, maybe.
I think we've done 1 and 2.
Okay. And then this was Councilmember Shade. Go ahead if you need. So this was Councilmember Shade asked me to put this in, and this is what's in Robert's rules, which is that and I did research, and it's the general rule that a member accused doesn't get to vote on whether or not he or she committed, the offense. I think you could change that by changing the rules if you wanted to, but you don't, like if you were accused of moving out of your place of residence or moving out of your district, you wouldn't get to vote on whether or not you moved out of your district. And
Oh man, let me comment on that. My father, when he first ran for office, he and a guy named Jim French ran against one another, who on the Chronicle. My dad beat him. My dad annexed to the city and had 16 days to go before the election and beat French by 4 votes. That's when it was partisan. French had already been through the primary and had no opposition. So my father ran as an independent and came up and beat him. Well, obviously the man who owns a newspaper, a voice that speaks to in particular the Black community, he was really upset about that. So there were hearings about residency and all that kind of stuff. Now at that time, there was a newly elected office, so he wasn't a seated councilman. They actually had to go to court for it. Went to the election commission and on the court, and my father won. But if you are in, and as he occupied that office, that was continuously challenged by Jim French, to the point to where the news media got involved, and my father actually held a press conference at this office, showing his light bill, his water bill, his utility bills, his property tax bills, etc. And that's how it went away. Okay, so if something like that came up to a vote on council, hey, if that member can prove that they actually have a residence in that district and live there, they should have the right to vote to say their vote shouldn't be taken from them. Because suppose they do in fact live in the district. So now if you can't provide, your driver's license, your voter's registration certificate, there are a number of ways to prove residency. But with that, he said that the member accused and on charge with conduct and studying about Constitution. I don't know, man. So how do they do it in Washington, man? I mean, anybody know about that? How do they do it in Columbia or Washington? I mean,
I don't know, but I'm just kind of thinking like in a court of law, like I don't get to vote if I'm found innocent.
yeah, but you're not part of the jury in the court of law. I mean, in this case, I guess the elected officials are the jury, I guess, in this case.
Right.
So I guess if we can parrot, if you're going to be censured in Congress, do you get to vote, yeah or nay, or you can't vote? I'd be willing to go along with however they do it in Congress or the state capitol.
That's what I would say is however it's done other places.
I'll look at that. That's no problem.
Okay. All right. And that's the end of it.
Oh, really?
That's it.
Yep. I mean, this is great because I haven't had lunch and I'm starving, man. So
there you go.
I haven't had lunch either.
So I think, are we all feeling that with the changes we've discussed today, we're, at least from our end, we're feeling
I feel good about it. I feel good about it. I feel good about it. I think the oath being added was a good touch. Hopefully moving away from the 3/4 to the 2/3 to have the hearing. Now, when coming out of it, after you have the hearing, so 2/3 to have the hearing. Now, when the time comes to vote guilty or not, is that also going to be a 2/3 vote?
So right now it's set at 3/4 because the thinking is, again, to make it difficult.
I understand, but to impeach a president, it takes 2/3. To impeach a governor, it takes 2/3. Man, listen, if I do something and 2/3 of my colleagues say, hey, you got to go, I need to go.
So would you like to keep it 2/3, 2/3?
I keep it at 2/3, 2/3.
Okay. All right. I'm fine with that. If,
Yeah. I'm okay with that.
okay.
Now, I just want y'all to know, when we vote on this, I'm walking in the chambers with the 10 commandments, and that's what I'm gonna abide by.
We all can agree on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I'm good
I mean,
with
I
it.
think, the thing about executive session, you change this to 2/3, 2/3. I think that, Keith, do you feel, from the conversations that you and Dudley and Mitchell raised, this brings a little
Oh,
bit
yeah,
more
see, the
comfort
part,
around it?
moving away, I understand this was just, it was the first try at first time around, but the part where you had a minority of council that could create a whole trial, and get something set on the agenda, that's the part that I
That was
really
it.
found
Okay.
offensive. You basically, 3 people, if I remember correctly, could have caused a trial to be held. And that's the embarrassing part. See, that's
Okay.
the embarrassing part. If 2/3 of the people on any elected body say, hey, you need to, you know, show why you did this, and if you did all these things, and those people vote 2/3 to get rid of you, I think you need to go. And I put myself in that position.
Right.
If 2/3 of this council, because I did something egregious in the community, albeit not illegal, um, I need to go. I'll be too disruptive to that body. So I'm okay with that part. What I didn't like is
The 3.
the smear and that public embarrassment, and you never even gotten to the point of whether you did it or not. So
Okay.
that's the
All
part.
right. Well, let's roll with these changes and see what
I guess one last point.
happens.
The piece about cutting off that, and you're right, Mr. McQueen, but I don't know that we would think about that. If somebody, getting their 15 minutes of fame, using my example, I'm laying the wood to Kevin. We all got to listen to that. You know how doing public comment, sometimes we have to listen to stuff that we don't want to listen to. That's one thing at public comment, but we should be able to cut off a colleague. Should be a triggering mechanism. And what you said would be right. Move for executive session, but I don't know that I would. Some of us got to be able to think of that. But anyway, you can bring that up when we explain this. But that is a good because this code of conduct will go beyond this council.
Right.
10 years from now, hopefully this is going to be in place. But anyway, that Robert rules, you do it. Unless I'm lambasting Kevin, and I don't say anything that speaks to something legal. If I don't say anything that Kevin went out there and cussed out my granddaughter, at the soccer field or something like that. And I'm giving him grief at city council for that. That's not, how would somebody say, we need to have executive session for legal consultation on this? Maybe.
Well, I think it's always about whether the conduct viewed in light of the oath of office, because I think the interpretation of the oath of office is always going to be a legal issue.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So, maybe we need to press pause and look up, there might be case law on a specific issue that we can look at.
That's a good point.
That's how I go about it. And hopefully I wasn't on YouTube with my calculator, because everybody would have seen me put 9/12 into my calculator. I don't know that equals 3/4, but yeah, sometimes I have trouble with math, even simple math.
No problem. Well, I'm good with this.
Right.
Number one, I want to thank everybody who took extraordinary amount of time. You, Mr. McQueenie, because we talked and kind of went through some other things, and Ms. Del Chapa, you and I had a one-on-one conversation. I really appreciate that, and you, Ross, you too, and Kevin, everybody on this. So I think we got a pretty good code of conduct moving forward. I thank Councilman Seekings for thinking, he's not here, but thinking about putting the oath of office in there as being part of it. I think that was a good add-on, very good add-on, as a matter of fact. So good. We do that once every 4 years. You know what? We live with that 365 days a year too.
Sure.
Good point. So Ross, I appreciate you reaching out to me after on this one, man, and all the positive comments coming forward on this. It's been a good effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Anything else, or are we ready for dinner and
I'm ready,
happy
man. I'm
hour,
telling you.
whatever the evening has in store for you?
All right.
We do need to vote on recommending the approval of the changes.
Okay, so can I get a motion to approve the changes?
So move.
Okay,
Second.
All right.
all right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it.
All right. Again,
Awesome.
thank you all a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank
Marie,
you.
great
Bye-bye.
job. Great
Bye.
job. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.